This happened to my father in 1975 in a little country bumpkin town when he was 7 years old, and his sister was 9. My father was a truck driver who had to be up at 2 a.m. every morning. That meant we had a rule in our house that no matter what, you can't wake Dad up when he goes to bed at 7 p.m. My mother worked at an old folks home till 10 p.m. every night, so for a couple of hours it was just me and my sister in the house by ourselves. It was our bedtime one night, so me and my sister went to bed. In a couple of minutes I heard something hitting the side of the house. Then it started hitting my window. It was really weird, so I got my sister to come in my room. We looked out the window and saw a man bouncing one of my toys against the window and catching it. He put his hand to his mouth and motioned for us to be quiet. Then he motioned for us to go outside and play with him. We were frozen in fear. Then he started walking away and we couldn't see him out the window. We ran to the kitchen and there he was motioning for us to open the sliding door. We knew we couldn't wake up Dad, so we ran and hid in the living room. The man walked to our front door and started whispering something we couldn't understand and making scratching noises. All we could do is cry and remain paralyzed. We saw car lights approaching the house. It was my mother returning home from work. We watched as the man ran off the porch and hid behind my father's truck. We watched the man smile and wait till our mother got out of the car. She got out, opened the trunk, got her belongings, and walked up on the porch. I'm embarrassed to say we were too scared to open the door and warn her. All we could do was watch as the man sneakily tiptoed behind her. She opened the front door and shut it behind her. She saw us hiding, and just as she was about to yell at us for being up so late, she saw our fear-stricken eyes glued to the glass on the front door. She turned around and saw his face pressed against the glass, and him jiggling the doorknob. She screamed, put all her weight against the door, and locked it, and called my grandfather who lived a street over. And then the man shouted profanities, and now he was going to rape her children in front of her. She called the police and told them as well. Next thing we know, my grandfather is speeding up the driveway with his gun out the window, just firing it randomly. The cops pulled up just as the man took off into the woods. They saw his back, but that was it. They chased him through the woods with dogs and had the whole squad out searching. Other officers inspected the house and saw multiple scratch marks at our doors and side of the house. Apparently, he tried to break in and couldn't, so he tried to lure us into letting him in. They never found out who it was, and that was the last we ever saw of him. We were all pretty traumatized for a while, but it didn't bother our dad one bit. In fact, he didn't wake up the entire time.
Number 4.
My best friend and I always FaceTime every day on our Macs, since she moved to Alberta. This particular time I had been home alone for 2 days and my parents would be returning home tomorrow. It was around 7 p.m. and my friend FaceTimed me. We began talking, and I complained about the noises my house made at night. It always sounded like the floors were creaking, like someone was walking around. As I was chatting, I noticed my friend seemed very pale in the face. I asked her if she was okay, and she told me that she had been sick all day and that I had only just noticed because she had moved into better light. That seemed really odd because I didn't notice her move from her spot. We talked for a few minutes more when I noticed she looked at something behind me. "I really like your green wall," she said. She took her phone out and started taking pictures of her computer screen. I asked her what she was doing and she stated that she was on Snapchat. Confused, I said, "I didn't have a green wall." She giggled and said, oh, she had forgot. She was colorblind. It was at that moment I knew something was very wrong. I had known her for quite some time and knew for a fact she wasn't colorblind. I picked up my phone and pretended to get a phone call. I asked the make-believe caller to hold on because I get the best reception outside, and I made my way to the door. I carried the laptop with me, and as soon as I got outside, I asked my friend to tell me what was wrong. She started blowing up my phone with picture messages. They were the photos she had been snapping earlier of what I thought was just my wall. My heart began to pound out of my chest when I noticed what looked like the outline of a person across the room. I bolted to my neighbor's house and banged on his door until he opened. I then heard the front door of my house open and then shut, and I knew the person was now outside. My neighbor finally opened up, and I barged in and shut the door. I told him what had happened, and he called the police. He went to his gun closet, retrieved a gun, and loaded it just in case. The police arrived fairly quickly, around 3 minutes or so, and caught the man trying to break into my neighbor's kitchen window. It turns out, the man was living in my house for a whole day and planned on raping me. The police told me I was lucky that my friend FaceTimed me because if she hadn't, I would have at the very least been raped, if not killed. I never stay home alone anymore. We bought a dog a week later.
Number 3.
A week or so before my 10th birthday, I walked to the corner store with a $5 bill and picked up a jar of ragu for my mom. On my way home, a man I'd never seen before fell in step with me and began talking. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "My name is Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" I walked along silently, not replying, and fervently hoping he would take that as a sign he should leave me alone. Subtleties were not his strong suit, though, because he kept right on chattering. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you? Of course, you're almost a big girl now. You'll be needing another kind of doctor soon, won't you? That's okay, though. They can still bring you to me until then. What's your name? You have beautiful hair." I was just on my way to get some suckers for the candy jar in my office. Do you like suckers? Thankfully, we were nearing my house, so I ran forward, up the back steps and through the kitchen door. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of a very long, very scary ordeal. It didn't take long after that for Dr. Ramsey to begin showing up. At first, it seemed benign, at least to a kid. He would drive by nearly every day, smiling and waving. I told my mom, who said maybe it was on his way home from work. But then, the phone calls began. My dad called me into the living room and sat me down. He asked about the day Dr. Ramsey followed me home, and if I talked to him. He said I wasn't in trouble, but that I needed to tell him the truth. I told him no, and he asked if I was sure. Could I be forgetting something? I told him no again, and he frowned, then asked, "Then how does he know your name?" I didn't know. It turns out, that was not all he knew. He knew my sister's name as well. Pretty soon, neither my sister or I were allowed to answer the phone. He called several times a day at first. Neither of us knew what he was saying. Then one night, one of my brothers told us that he was telling my parents that he was going to hurt me, and later my sister. Things got complicated after that. My dad had called the police, but as this was before there were any stalking laws, there was not a lot they could do. They told my parents to call back if he tried anything. My dad then called a friend of his from back in the day, who happened to be a cop. For the next month, my dad's friend escorted me to and from school. Suddenly, life as I knew it came screeching to a halt. I couldn't walk to school alone. I couldn't play outside. I couldn't walk to Super America. which was sort of like a 7-Eleven for those who don't know. When access to me was completely denied, things escalated. It was around this time he began threatening my sister as well. Then one afternoon my sister, 2 of my brothers, my mom, and I were in the kitchen. One of my brothers saw a glimpse of someone in the garage. They'd seen him too. Dr. Ramsey came bolting out of the garage, my brothers chasing after him. They ran all the way to Cherokee Park, where he had lost them in the trees. My parents called the police again, but nothing came of it. The only information they had was a description and a name that was almost certainly fake. A couple weeks later, we woke to find our dog hanging from the side porch. She was a gorgeous, saddleback German Shepherd, born the same day I was. We were all devastated. The cops said there was no evidence it was him, and ruled it an accident, but none of us believed that. His phone calls became more informative in the meantime. He would talk about who was home and who wasn't. If my brother would say my dad was home, he would tell him who was really in the house. He also would talk about the house itself, about the window in the kitchen he could easily open with a knife from the outside, even when it was locked, and about the French doors that connected the living room to the side porch, and how the lock could be finagled from the outside if you jiggled it just right. That night my dad put in some carpenter nails at the bottom of the French doors until he could get a new lock ordered. My parents had to go to a company event for my dad's work. My older brothers were at Saints West roller skating rink. My sister was on the phone with her best friend. My little brother was on the floor asleep. I was watching Devo on the midnight special with Wolfman Jack. It was late. Suddenly the top of the French doors swung inward, and in the few milliseconds before the nails in the bottom caused them to snap back, I could see his silhouette. My sister whipped the phone at the television, and we ran up the stairs. About halfway up, we realized our little brother was still asleep on the living room floor. As quietly as we could, we slipped back down the stairs to get him. We all went into our bedroom and didn't turn on the light. This way, we could see outside. We watched out the window for a while, and when we didn't find him, we crept down the hall to our brother's room to look. We looked down the hall and could see someone standing at the back door. He knocked, loudly. "What do you want?" my sister asked out the window. He stepped back and said, "Is this the Mercy residence? I have a pizza for delivery. Can you come to the door?" She scoffed at him, declaring she was not stupid. She could see he didn't have a pizza, and she was calling the cops. He left. A short while later, my brothers returned home. We told them what happened, and they walked around the yard watching for him. They came back in, and things settled down. By now, we'd pretty much given up calling the cops because it never helped. So we just went back in, each of us, except my youngest brother, still asleep, carrying a knife from the kitchen, just in case. Eventually, one of my brothers went into the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal as a snack. You know that sensation you get when you can just feel someone watching you? Yeah. He had that in spades. He kept looking around the kitchen, through the doorway, into the dining room, at the windows. He didn't see anything, but he could still feel eyes on him. So he went closer to the door to try to see better. The kitchen lights were reflecting on the windows of the door. It had 3 rows of 3 windows. So he still couldn't see. He stepped closer, and then closer again, until he was right up to the door. Then cupped his hands on either side of his head so he could see. There on the other side of the window pane was Dr. Ramsey, smiling back at him. He turned to yell for my older brothers, and when he looked back again, he was gone. They went out again to look for him, but didn't see him. The next night, we were at the table playing Crazy Eights, and my brother was restless. My sister asked him what's wrong. And he said he always felt like any minute now, there would be a boom, boom, boom on a door or window. Almost immediately after he finished his sentence. On the window right behind him. In the chaos, the two eldest ran out, but he was already gone. A couple of weeks later, I was at school, and we were outside on the playground during recess. I was swinging upside down when I saw that now familiar blue Ford Galaxy cruising by, moving slowly. There he was, smiling and waving. He called my name, and I ran to the teacher and told her. The school had been told all about him, and she took me inside right away and called my mom. That same day, my mom had gotten a call from the school office asking her to verify that my dad was picking me up, as he'd called to say he was on his way. He wasn't. Not long after that, I woke up one night, thirsty. I went down to the kitchen for a drink, and there, sitting alone in the dark, was my dad. On the table, a gun. He was tired of the police waiting until Dr. Ramsey tried something. He was tired of his children being terrorized. He was tired of being afraid every time he left for work that something would happen to us while he was gone. I sat with him for a time, watching, before he sent me back to bed. These events and many more took place over a period of around 18 months. Then as suddenly as it began, it was over. He had vanished from our lives. The phone calls, the drive-by with creepy waves, everything. For a long time, during and after the Dr. Ramsey days, I would have a recurring nightmare in which I would wake up to find him standing over me as I slept. It took a long time before I felt like a kid again. I found out years later that when he was calling, Dr. Ramsey would tell my parents that he was going to rape and kill me, and later my sister, and that there was nothing they could do about it. I don't know what happened to him when he disappeared. I don't know if he was in a car wreck, locked in prison, in a coma, but sometimes I wonder if the wait ended for my dad when he was sitting in the darkened kitchen one night. I don't know. And I'm not sure I want to.
Number 2.
I live in a town in South Australia called Whyalla. It's a good, decent, friendly town. It has its good and its bad. For instance, new construction sites with potential new shopping centers. But then, there's the horrible ice epidemic in the bad communities. One day a fellow friend and I went out during the night to go clubbing, as most teenagers do in this town on weekends. We went out and started walking to the club, until we came across a strange man who was asking us if we had any gear. For you people who don't know what gear is, it's another word for crack cocaine or methamphetamines. We quickly assumed he was a druggie because we understood what gear was, and told him we did not have any. He was reluctant and said if we had no gear, did we have any pills? We said we didn't have that either, but this didn't satisfy him. He proceeded to ask us for money so he could buy some from a dealer who didn't live very far from there. But we reiterated that we didn't have anything he needed, and we would be making our way to the club. A sudden angry expression came across his face, and he pulled out a knife. We pleaded, "Please don't hurt us. We will just give you what we have." But then my friend decided it was a good idea to kick him in the nuts, and then yelled at me to run. We began running when two other people emerged from nowhere. They must have been hiding just around the corner or something. We continued running, but instead of running to my house, we decided to hide in some woods not too far away from my place, so that they wouldn't know where I lived. They weren't too awfully far behind, maybe a block, when we turned a corner at a big tree along some bushes mixed with other trees and decided to duck down and hide. My adrenaline was pumping. I felt so scared. I could tell by the look on my friend's face he was feeling the same. The three men came towards our area and said, "It's only a matter of time before we catch you." We remained hidden. My friend was so nervous his feet were shaking, making a noise as they did so against the leaves. I covered his mouth and made a shushing motion with my finger. As we watched them go back and forth, we could now see the faces of the other men. They looked so grungy and dirty, total meth heads, and they were all smiling too. Their eyes were bloodshot, like they were on PCP, which made the situation even more horrifying. They finally, after quite some time, began walking further away into a busier area. At which time we jumped up and booked it back home, locking the doors. We discussed the whole ordeal, but not once did we consider calling the cops. Don't ask why, because I don't know.
Number 1.
I'm an English teacher, and because of my profession, I have been to several countries outside of the United States. A few weeks ago, I was in Hong Kong teaching a group of Cantonese teenagers English for a month. It was a very rewarding experience, but my last night in Hong Kong made me apprehensive to leave my apartment ever again. I have been to Hong Kong before, so when it was time for me to head back, I was not at all shy of the fast-paced city life it provided. My mother, on the other hand, was nervous. She mentioned several times that I shouldn't leave the group to wander off alone and that I needed to always be aware of my surroundings. And she ended with a joke about a friend of hers who rescues women from the sex slave industry. At the time, it was hilarious, and after reminding her that Hong Kong is one of the safest cities in the world, I was off. Now, I stand out in Asian countries. I am 5'8", pale, with light eyes and hair, and I am well endowed with plenty of natural assets. Basically, I stuck out like a sore thumb. Whenever I left the hostel, I would notice plenty of men gawking at my chest or staring for too long. But I never really let it bother me because no one made any advances. I was having a grand old time all summer, and I felt completely safe. Until my last night in the city, that is. My students wanted to take me out to dinner my last night, so I met them near their homes. I don't remember the exact stop we met at, but it opened up to a night market, and was a few blocks away from a very popular mall called Dragon Center. We stood around the opening of the station as we waited for the last few students to arrive, when I started to notice that I was getting a little bit too much attention to be comfortable. A boy with a microphone who was advertising a TV noticed me and called out to me during his sales pitch. And then, several men from India or surrounding countries started to take notice as well. The men from India were obviously wealthy comparatively. One man who was particularly bold blew kisses to me as he longingly assessed my body and motioned for me to join him in a sex shop a few yards away. I felt violated, but more angry that he would do that while I was standing with 6 children. I turned in a huff to leave and walked to the restaurant, and that's when I noticed the first man. He was of Jamaican or Caribbean island descent, and he stuck out in the crowd more than I did. He locked eyes with me, and his lips curled into a smile as he made a show of looking me up and down. Without breaking eye contact, he pulled out a phone and began speaking into it in another language. I rolled my eyes and urged my kids to start the half-mile trek to the restaurant. I didn't want to make them nervous, so I did my best to blow off what was happening. After the first block, I turned to see the man on the phone was following us, and he was still locked in on me. I grabbed my umbrella from my bag and held it, just in case. I turned around again after the second and third block, and he kept his pace even with ours, still talking away in another language on the phone and still staring me down with a lusty smile on his lips. Finally, my students and I neared the restaurant, and I turned to see the man stop and hang up the phone. He gave me one last look before he winked and turned to walk away. I was fuming at this point. This guy was ruining my last night with my students. It wasn't until I turned back to the restaurant that I saw the group appear from out of thin air. They were all of the same ethnic origin as the man who followed me on the phone, only there was 5 or 6 of them. They congregated a few yards away from me, and they were staring directly at me. All my senses were screaming red alert by that point. I gripped my umbrella tighter and held it up like a baseball bat in case they approached me or my students. The men chuckled at me and waited until my students walked into the restaurant. I went in last, after making sure they were all safe inside, and turned back one last time to see a man from the group directly behind me. He towered over me. His eyes bulged out of his face and his lips cut into a deep, menacing smile against his cheeks. He leaned down so he was eye level with me and then slowly started to wave at me as I backstepped and stumbled into the restaurant. I could tell by the look on his face exactly what was happening. I was the prey, and they were hunting me. I couldn't relax after that. My students and I sat down in the restaurant and I tried to enjoy my meal, but I looked up several times to see the men hanging around the door. It took about an hour and a half before they finally disappeared. I walked outside with my students and looked around closely, but I couldn't see them anymore, except for the one who was standing at the end of the road. I couldn't afford a taxi, and I certainly wasn't going to leave my kids to fend for themselves after this, so I grabbed them by their arms, and we hightailed it back to the station. I still don't think they realized what exactly was going on, but I know they realized that I was nervous. We made it back without seeing the men again, and I was careful to watch for them in case they tried to follow me again. I was honestly convinced that I was going to end up kidnapped or killed my last night in Hong Kong. I made it home without any issues, thankfully, and all my students made it home safe too.